Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of our April Asset Management webinar series, where we focus for 30 minutes on a key topic in the asset management space and take you through a presentation in that regard. So just from me, my name is Gary Fitzpatrick. I'm a principal in the asset management department here in Dublin in KPMG, and I'll be your moderator for the day. So just a quick recap on where we're at in the series. So we have held two webinars already. So the first one focused on fraud. The second one last week, we went through key trends in the asset management industry. And today we plan to go through human rights and supply chain due diligence for asset managers. And there is two further webinars on the 23rd of April and the 30th of April that you can register for at our social media links on LinkedIn, or there should be a link in the interface of the program you're signed into today as well. So just a few housekeeping issues. So it is an interactive session, so feel free to use the question and answer box to submit any questions that you may come across during the course of the session. It is interactive as well, so you can take action and you can like, or certain emojis are available there for reactions. And you can also have access to the speaker profiles, so for myself and Catherine today. So shifting to the focus of today's webinar, and I suppose due diligence has become a very important aspect for participants of the asset management industry and many industries today, all industries in fact. And obviously we've seen a large legislative and regulator push on due diligence practices. So in the industry we're talking about today, we have SFDR, which is live. We have CSRD, which is live. And on the horizon as well, we have the due diligence directive as well that's going to be transposed into Irish law. So today we plan to look at due diligence with a human rights kind of perspective on it and a lens. So there is obviously reporting requirements in SFDR and in CSRD at the moment in respect of human rights. And I'm happy to say I'm joined today by Catherine Gillespie, who you may have met already if you joined the first webinar series, webinar event in this series, I should say. Catherine is the head of forensics in KPMG, and she works on a day-to-day basis with clients and helps them implement procedures in respect of human rights due diligence into their normal course practices and their everyday as well. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Catherine to take us through the presentation. We will have a short Q&A session at the end for around 5 minutes. So as I said, feel free to leave any questions in the question and answer box, and we will do our best to get to them. If we don't get to them on the session, because the timing is quite tight, we will respond after through email with the relevant contact details. So Catherine, over to you.
Thanks so much, Gary, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Yes, human rights due diligence, we're all being challenged a little bit more with these terms at the moment because of sustainability regulations coming in. But also, I think there's a general sort of a wider view on this as well in general compliance programs. So we're going to walk out and try and demystify some of the terms you might have heard, what it means, and unpick that a little bit. So today we're going to do a little bit of an introduction on human rights, look at the term of a human rights due diligence process, and thinking then about the role of human rights due diligence in ESG regulation. So first of all, what is human rights? This is generally where we have to start and what exactly encompasses a human right. Some people think of human rights, they think about modern slavery issues, forced labour issues. But as we'll come and we'll explore further in this presentation, human rights actually expands across a number of different aspects, and not in those not just in those kind of really serious parts, and or sort of criminal aspects. So where the sort of basis of what is a human right, it actually comes back down into 1948 guidance, the UN United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and also 1998 Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights to Work. Very often, whenever there's a definition of human rights, it really points back to these two pieces, two declarations. And within the next slide, we'll go through exactly what is encompassed within those different declarations. And I also wanted to draw your attention, just as we move through the timeline, a lot of at the end of this, we're focused on the sustainability directives and regulations. But I wanted in this slide just to point that there's quite a lot. This is a long history of consideration of human rights. A lot of it from to date has all been recommendations around best practice, and just the sustainability legislation is requiring us to put a little bit more focus on that. Reading through some of those declarations, there is repeated references to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and that was first introduced in 1976. It has been reviewed a number of different times, covering human rights, labour rights, environment, bribery, and other topics, and it sets out what multinational enterprises should be doing for responsible business conduct. And then we also have the United Nations, the UNGP, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And here there are 31 different principles organised under 3 pillars of protect, respect, and remedy that are all trying to build better business conduct and addressing human rights related issues through these guiding principles. And then as we move on, these terminologies are continuing to reappear in CSRD as a guideline of a way of maybe considering the social factors issues within ESRS. And then it's specifically called out in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, as being something that the organisations within scope should be implementing in their business. So what do we mean by human rights? As I've mentioned, sometimes it's the sort of that box at the bottom, the child labour, the forced labour. Those are the issues that people are thinking about from a human rights related perspective. But as the slide points out, there's quite a wide range of issues that are covered within human rights. To the left, we've got the working conditions, and that really spawns from those ILO declarations. So thinking about the rights of people for secure employment, adequate wages, freedom of association, health and safety. Then we're moving through into equal treatment and opportunities. Gender equality sits within this. Preventing violence and harassment also sits within human rights. Moving again further across to the right, we've got community and cultural rights, economic and social, civil and political, and then Indigenous peoples' rights. And then further to the right-hand side, we've got information and inclusion, privacy, access to products, access to quality information, all of which are considered under this topic. And looking at this, there might be a little bit of a surprise. Actually, I never really thought of these issues being human rights related issues. But that's going back into the definitions of what are often called human rights does point to these issues. And there's a good point in that, and we'll come on to it in a little bit more detail in this in the presentation, is because it spans so many issues, it means your organisation and your portfolio companies are already dealing with some of these issues on a day-to-day basis, and that can be leveraged when we're thinking about how to address negative impacts on people. And ultimately, that's what this is all about, is trying to make sure that organisations are not having an adverse impact on people. So why does it matter to asset managers? So as we've touched on already, there's lots of new regulations and responsibility to respect human rights are built in within that, and we're required to report on it, build in mechanisms to review it and try and identify impacts and negative impacts. Also, it can be material. We can be material and financially material. So there may be higher operational and legal costs, and that's because we're seeing more and more cases being brought across the globe that do relate to human rights related issues. And what's interesting about that is because often this is a little bit of a global issue, we do need to think about where our impacts are across all aspects of where we work, because some pieces of litigation that are taking place in one part of the world may ultimately have an impact on us here. In addition, another way around privacy of data, that's also quite a high profile way of where there have been penalties and could be a financial impact on companies if they're not protecting that privacy aspect. A key element of why this matters is interested in ensuring their money is invested in a manner that respects human rights. And in some cases, it's their core mission. So having an understanding of what this is and what it means and how to identify what's good practice is a way of being able to give more comfort to how sustainability has been built in to your everyday work. Then we've got reputational risk, and this is probably one of the biggest features. It certainly has an impact on financial materiality and kind of all across all of the other points 1 to 4 there. But reputational risk and the activism of media organisations to try and work out where funds have been allocated, how are they having a negative impact, and kind of looking for that big news story at all points. And so there's aspects within human rights due diligence, which we'll come on to now, which can help protect and help think about how is our organisation addressing and identifying if we have a risk, a human rights related risk. So that's where we come on to human rights due diligence. And human rights due diligence is defined within this sort of 6-step process. It's set out in the OECD guidelines. And the 6 steps that are involved, and the first one is around building in policies and procedures and considering human rights related issues and how you address them and what your commitment is within your policies and procedures. And as we discussed earlier, there's quite a range. You may have a specific human rights related policy, but actually you'll have an equality policy already. You might have a discrimination policy already. All of these feed in to what a human rights due diligence process, and having those policies and practices in place is something that is positive and demonstrates that there is a commitment within the organisation to respect of human rights, and that is a positive thing that can be leveraged and drawn out. The next second part is around identifying and assessing adverse impacts. Actually, with having a consideration within the business of what are my likely human rights related impacts? Who do I work with, or what is my business operations, and what are the business operations of my portfolio companies that might mean they are more at risk of a human rights related issue. So what the requirements here are around putting in a mechanism to help identify human rights related impacts. So that could be, making sure you've got open communications within your business. That might mean reaching out to those that you're working with and understanding more about what their policies and procedures are in this area. And through those mechanisms and series of procedures, trying to work out what is the impact of this organisation on people. The third case is identifying, ceasing and preventing and mitigating. If you've identified that there may be a potential risk, how are you going to address it? How are you going to prevent it? What needs to be put in place? That is often the area, and we'll come on to that in the next slide, a little bit more fleshed out. Whilst there might not be a mechanism to identify some adverse impacts, already in a lot of organisations, they're already doing things that do help to cease, prevent and mitigate negative human rights issues. We then move on to tracking the implementation and results. And we're seeing this more and more within general compliance requirements around monitoring. And we see it in a lot of the guidance that are given out from different entities around bribery and what a good compliance program looks like. And this here around tracking the implementation results, looking at, is what you're doing actually making it better? Do you need to change your role and your position and your approach accordingly? So really key focus of what human rights due diligence is. And then we come to communications and telling people, how impacts are addressed and bringing that level of transparency. And a lot of that is what CSRD is trying to address within this area. Then the sixth step is the step that it's always crafts some interesting conversations about remediation. What remediation do you provide, and what does that really mean in the context of a human rights related risk? And actually, that's the area where there's often quite a lot already going on, because there'll be grievance processes in place. You might have whistleblowing processes in place that all help you identify issues, investigate to see what has happened and the facts around that, and then taking appropriate action behind the scenes. So stepping back from that, and just in the big blue box, it's all around engagement and having good conversations, trying to work out what our risks are, and thinking about it from across the organisation. Human rights due diligence for me is really just another kind of compliance mechanism. It's, whenever you go through a whole lot of compliance programs, having your policies in place, your risk assessment, which is identifying your impacts, how you impact them, how you address them. It all fits into what our organisations are often doing for other types of risks. And therefore, the opportunity is to build in human rights due diligence alongside that, and just think a little bit more widely. So I wanted to kind of bring some examples, and some of which I've touched on in my excitement today. But first of all, policies and management systems, we touched on that. You might have diversity and inclusion policies already, health and safety policies. Supplier codes of conduct as well are also good examples of sort of what you might see as a best practice activity in human rights due diligence. Identifying, assessing impacts. Ways of doing that can be, you might see, or you might want to see, employee surveys, whistleblowing hotlines, and maybe some employee groups that are seeking to gather information. The bit around this, and where companies often don't have a key focus and are not maybe necessarily actively thinking about this. So it's about putting a structure in place. How do we identify our impacts? As I mentioned, preventing and mitigating impacts might already be something we're doing an awful lot of. So that will be around, coaching, mentoring, community initiatives as well. And when I pop across to monitoring effectiveness, often you'll see references to audits that are being undertaken to cover different issues and risks, and for some companies might end up doing a employee audit to make sure that they're meeting the requirements there. So really interesting, and in an awful lot of cases there already is policies and procedures and practices in place that can be leveraged and built on. I think one thing we see is a lot of companies going, we're starting from scratch and we have to build something new, when there's definitely lots of opportunities to build on what's already in place. So what is the role, and thinking about then human rights due diligence, and how can it benefit our responses to some of the sustainability legislation out there. So in SFDR, it primarily applies to financial institutions. Identifying and communicating principal adverse impacts is a key element within that, and it does include human rights related issues, social and employee concerns, human rights and bribery and corruption matters as well. Whilst there's no specific HRDD requirement within that, human rights due diligence can be a mechanism for investors to consider and report on their human rights performance, and helps understand, what is being done, how are companies working and dealing with this, if at all. So that's a kind of an interesting, a lens of how it supports on SFDR. CSRD, we have where human rights due diligence is really, it's not a specific, it's not called out as a requirement within there, but there is also a requirement under the social factors to consider human rights and report on those as well. And so whilst putting in a human rights due diligence process isn't necessary, when you look through the current requirements of CSRD and the different reporting elements within it, they do refer to those same 6 headings around policies and procedures, impacts, actions that we're taking, and how elements are tracked and monitored. So there is definitely an overlap and an alignment with the OECD guidelines and the requirements of HRDD. So it can help, and I know some clients who are implementing procedures in order to help them address those. Then we're looking to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And this in its original form was looking at implementation of due diligence and requiring it. Now, most for asset managers, we might not necessarily need to be doing it ourselves because of the employee turnover and requirements, but we may wish to be seeing it, and some of our portfolio companies may wish to be considered and covered by it. So this does require human rights due diligence to be implemented. One of the interesting elements in the new Omnibus is that this requirement, the fines elements of it, has moved away, and which I think means it's sort of good. That was certainly an area that was causing a lot of concern. So within this, we have I think with human rights due diligence, it provides us such an opportunity and a real mechanism from which to demonstrate how we are considering human rights and the adverse impact of people within organizations. It's something that you want to see people bringing in if you're assessing how they're reviewing human rights and dealing with this. And it may be also something that people want to implement within their own policies and procedures for the benefit of the organization, and demonstrating to others how they're considering human rights within everyday practices. So I'm going to wrap up there. It might be a little bit earlier, so I'm not sure if we've got any questions coming through yet, Gary.
Yes, we do actually, Catherine, and thanks for that presentation. It really outlined the landscape for human rights at present really well, I think. And the 6-step framework is really helpful, especially for those indirect type kind of requirements in CSRD and SFDR, although it's not, called out specifically like the due diligence directive. So I suppose just to touch on one question, just looking for kind of like market insights or kind of clients that you've experienced perhaps that have implemented the HRDD and how that kind of works in practice and looks.
So that how that worked in practice, it's very, I believe it should be specific to the organization and right-sized. Human rights due diligence, it's all about risk. It's a risk-based approach. So how we have been implementing it in businesses and practices is having a good deep dive into the organization as it and what they're currently doing. As we mentioned in the session today, there's quite a lot is already being undertaken by businesses, and it's important to first of all understand that and build it in. So you're not reinventing the wheel. We've all got enough going on at the moment. So that's the first primary impact, is understanding what do we have already and where are our gaps. And then the next steps are kind of addressing any gaps. for me, the biggest thing around is getting that structure of your identification of impacts. What and where we've been having a consideration. You also think about what companies are doing. So if they've got employee groups that come together to discuss issues, how are you getting feedback from them? How are you getting feedback from your whistleblowers? If there's any themes coming out there that might mean that you have an impact on your organization. And then how you're thinking as well about bringing in external sources on expertise into that risk assessment process. And it's kind of building a risk assessment. And from then on, it's about, it's all around looking at those risks that you've identified. That's the hard part. And taking actions. And we have found on so many occasions, once you've got the impacts down and the potential negative impacts, you already think about, well, we have that initiative within the organization which addresses that, and maybe we should just, focus on that and maybe put some metrics around it. That's the other area that we're seeing organizations are thinking about. Well, we have this already. What kind of metrics would we maybe want to put around it? And then it sort of fits that human rights due diligence 6-step mechanism. So it's very tailored. It's because it has to be right-sized for the specific organization and the risks and what they're doing. But that also means that it can be pragmatic. We're not, reinventing the wheel and trying to do things in a really practical way.
Yeah, and I know you made the point around kind of fund allocations and investment managers getting more focus from investors and media, etc., on what their funds are investing into and the kind of the wider value chain. So it is good to hear that organizations are certainly doing this already. They have these policies in place. The directive obviously coming in the next few years when it's transposed and effective, that will, I suppose, really help moderate that data that's coming to the managers as well. So I think it's all really positive. Okay, so that's the only questions we had. So unless anyone has any further questions, we might give everyone back 3 minutes on this lovely Irish weather day outside. But thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. As mentioned at the start, we do have 2 further webinars. One on the 23rd of April, which will focus on the global Pillar 2 tax considerations for funds specifically, and then we wrap up the series with on the 30th of April with a legal and regulatory update from my colleagues in the KPMG law. So hopefully you can make it for them. We will send an email post this session, which will have links, etc., for registration and any feedback you may have on the session today. So with that, thanks, Catherine, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. And we look forward to seeing you in the next installment. Thank you.